Great. So can I welcome everybody to our second live session today, which is on loss and dispersal. And we have several wonderful papers which you have already listened to, and we have 6 presentations and quite a few questions from the audience. So if it is all right with you, I will go straight to questions, and I will start with questions that are for several speakers or for the entire panel, and then I will ask questions for individual speakers. Would this be all right? And as far as I understand, we can take live questions from the audience as we did in the last session. I'm not sure exactly how to do this, but I hope the moderators will help me with this. So can we start with questions that were asked to several speakers in this panel? So the first question is from Simon Thomas, Milton Keynes, UK. And this is the question primarily for Karen, Sarah, and Mike. And it is about collaborations between scholars and private collectors. So Simon is asking whether you could imagine a service that would allow collectors to have their manuscripts dated, localized, and translated by scholars. And in return, scholars will have a greater access to private collections. So do you think this is possible? And this is generally a question about your experience of working with private collectors. So do you have to work in private collectors as part of your research? What is your experience? Do you think that formalizing the relationship, establishing a service, something like what Simon described, is a good idea? Any takers on this question? I noticed that there have been some replies on Twitter.
There's a Simon saying in the chat that wasn't quite how he phrased it.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe
Right.
you can jump in to fine-tune that then.
Yeah.
I assumed that the exact wording of the question was circulated to you. So I'm just looking for the exact wording of the question. And here it is. Given the quantity of historic loss and the amount that is still unknown, is it possible that a previously unknown fragment, so it is possible that a previously unknown fragment could redefine our approach to an area of manuscript or textual study? Is it possible to imagine a mechanism to interact with private collections and the art market, a service which offered a collector an approximate translation, date, and suspected origins that would in turn allow the academic community the chance to record and photograph otherwise unknown fragments? Would any of the panelists like to comment on this?
I can break the ice maybe
Yes,
by saying I have never worked with private collectors. So as a scholar and not active in the GLAM sector, so I couldn't answer that part of the question. But I do think that some kind of service up in the cloud that you could use for dating and transcribing manuscripts, that would be very, very useful. But I think that it would require quite a bit of effort and money also. And also, once you have that service, you have to keep it running for a longer time. So it requires maintenance. So I don't think it's an easy project, but sure, it would be very helpful. But maybe we should do this in the first place for the scholars and not so much for the art market. That will be my take on this.
Oh, I could add, I actually wrote an answer to that when we got it in the email. I'm sorry, did I interrupt somebody? I didn't mean to. I agree with Mike there, thank you, that it would be a possible way of providing new perspectives, but I agree there also with for research, so a way of researchers to gain access to fragments in private collections and making them accessible. But I have not been part of, or I'm not really familiar with the workings of the market either. So the service as a service, I would think also for research. Yeah, and then I had a thought about AI or machine learning, but that's just a wild idea. So it was just I mean, as a way of doing it, but it would require so much effort to date and to so many experts to reassemble codices, for example. So it's not maybe something that just is going to happen with the snap of your fingers.
I think with the AI, I think we are getting much closer to broad dating with handwriting style of handwriting recognition. So it would be possible, I think, to date something at least to a couple of centuries, which is better than nothing. And often that's all that collectors will really want. The first Dark Archives, we had Laura Light, who was actually works in the art market. And she relies very, very heavily on academics describing manuscripts for her, which they pay quite reasonably as well. But they sort of calculate that they're looking at a month, maybe 2 months work for a proper commercial description. So it is quite expensive, but then there's, depending on the text, there's a lot of money in selling manuscripts, essentially. As Columba said, the only way to make money is by selling them, often stealing them and then selling them, in fact. But there we go.
Great.
I don't know whether could I ask Sarah, because in Sweden one is obliged as a public service, as employed by a university, to give free consultations to the public, and I mean, theoretically collectors could just turn up and ask for a manuscript fragment to be identified. Usually that is only really availed of by people for checking whether what they're writing in their tattoo is actually correct or not. Usually it's not, and they pay no attention to what the correct version is as well, but there we are.
All right, there is a question from Laura that is for the entire panel. Laura says that loss is generally presented as something negative that needs to be corrected or put right. But are there any positive aspects of loss? Can we talk about romance of rediscovery that motivates medievalists? What makes finding what is lost so alluring? Any comments on the positive aspects of loss? And loss is essentially having to work with limited data. And is this unique to medievalists? And is this unique to historians and humanities scholars in general? Or do all researchers have to work with limited data? And is it something that motivates us?
Can I? So I thought that was a very interesting question. I thought a little about it yesterday. So of course it's related, I think, to a classic dualism, like life only has meaning because of death, etc. But here I think that indeed loss has the positive aspect that the more you lose, the more precious becomes what remains of what you have. So Beowulf, for instance, is special because we only have one Beowulf. So in a way that is a positive aspect, that you learn to cherish more what actually remains. Right? Of course, this isn't limited to medieval studies. I think you can find it across the sciences, I think.
If I could come in there and follow up what Mike was saying, I very much agree with him, that it's so important that we embrace the subject of loss within our the way we look at what does survive, and to have an impression about what's particular about what has survived, what may be, and sometimes we may not always be so conscious about what's maybe unique about what has survived. And I think this is where the comparative approach and the widening of our horizons can be so useful. I mentioned in the chat on, I've forgotten the name of the platform, discussion platform, that I found very useful an article written by the late Mark Whittow, an Oxford Byzantine historian who very sadly died just 2 or 3 years ago, and he made it was published posthumously, an article in a collection of essays published by Past and Present journal on the global Middle Ages, where he presents an absolutely masterly survey of the uneven patterns of production, survival, and loss. And one of the things that really came out to me reading that I hadn't really thought about before was how astonishing the European Middle Ages are for how much the durable material of parchment was used. This came out listening to Scott's paper, and then listening to Karen's paper, and the point Karen made about it's that repurposing of parchment as end leaves, which has given us evidence of 13th century English polyphony to set alongside and contrast with the more familiar, more well-studied, very beautiful, but very rare surviving codices from France. If I could perhaps sort of turn this into a question and throw it over to Scott and others, the loss of papyrus from late antique and early medieval Europe, and how that has distorted the prism through which we study our material. So I think there is a sense in which we need to get excited about both what's been lost as well as the thrill of discovery.
Scott, would you like to comment on this?
On papyrus particularly, I don't have a whole lot to say except to say that absolutely, Tessa, we're left with the record that we have, and those materials that were not durable and no longer survive, obviously we can't take into account whatever they used to witness. The question of loss that came to mind for me as you were all talking actually had to do with erasures. It had to do with the survival of palimpsests and the kind of material that medieval people thought was expendable and could be overwritten, and they were only too happy to lose in some way if they needed the material, that is the vellum, to create copies of text they deem more important. I like dealing with palimpsests because they give us a sense of the value judgments made by medieval scribes. They give us a sense of what medieval people may have thought was expendable, and yet we're able to recover the loss they purposefully embraced. And there's a certain intentionality there when a scribe decides what to erase or what to overwrite with, that I think is fun to think with. But I'm sorry, that was a tangent from Tessa's comment.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
I will now continue with questions for individual speakers, and I will follow the order of the papers on the program. So Scott is actually our first speaker, and there is a question addressed to you from a member of the audience. So I will just read out. Well, and first of all, congratulations on your funding from NIH.
Oh yes, thank you.
Which NIH program is this?
It's the general fellowship program. I must admit, it was very, very nice to see the National Endowment for the Humanities fund what I would call an old-fashioned project on manuscripts and late antique intellectual history. And so, yes, thank you.
That's absolutely wonderful news.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the question from a member of the audience, which I will read out. In the 10th and 11th centuries, Byzantium would use Greek philosophical and particularly scientific texts as part of their diplomacy with Islamic polities. Do you see any earlier continuity in this regard to the transfer of Greek patristics to the West, that their diplomatic gifts of crucial philosophical writings to Muslim rulers was modeled on an earlier transfer of theological works to the West?
I only have one example, and that's the example I began the talk with. And so it probably stands out in the imagination, but it is completely unique. To my knowledge, no, there was no diplomatic component to this at all. We see that with relics, but not with patristic texts, to my knowledge. Greek patristic texts are almost always translated in the context of Westerners on Latin and Latin speakers on what Michael McCormick beautifully calls the imperial edge. People who are on the the fringe of the or in the middle ground between the Eastern and Western Roman empires, who have some kind of fluency in both languages. And it's almost always people creating text for Western audiences when they feel the Western audiences can no longer handle the Greek. But I've never seen, other than the one example I used at the beginning of the paper, I've never seen writings this kind of writing given as a diplomatic gift. Mm-hmm. And the diplomatic gift that was given in the early 9th century that I began my paper with is also a kind of tricky one, since the Greek text was largely illegible to most people who would have come in contact with it. And even the Latin translations of it that were made don't show that show pretty clearly the Greek wasn't always understood. So it's a tricky kind of, it's an emblem, but it wasn't a practical gift in that respect. But it's a great question. I wish I had more information about it, but I've never seen any other example.
You started your paper by pointing out that there is not enough scholarship on Latin translations of Greek patristic works. Mm-hmm. And you talked about the reasons for mm-hmm. this situation. Mm-hmm. And you pointed out that translations are often seen as derivative and less mm-hmm. interesting. Can you give an example that demonstrates that this is not so? What are some of the best examples in your fields that show that translations are important and independent texts, interesting from different point of view, from linguistic point of view, historical, literary, and so on? Yeah. That we're right to study translations.
Yeah, I can think of one. The one that comes immediately to mind, I mean, there's a number of texts that we have in translation that are hugely important and that scholars have spent a lot of time on, beginning with the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. And then, of course, the various versions of the Latin Bible, whether the Vetus Latina or Jerome's Vulgate. And so, these texts are widely influential. A lot of energy has been spent studying the transmission of this knowledge because they're fundamental to the Christian religious tradition. And in some cases, the topic came up earlier about the rarity of certain kinds of texts that kind of amplify their importance in the field. And so the other text that came immediately to mind to me was the Old Saxon Hellion, a product of the early 9th century, which is a very rare Saxon voice, as it were, this cultural appropriation of the Christian story set in a Saxon idiom that has been very, very well studied. Part of the problem with Greek patristics being translated into Latin is that it's patristics. It's a kind of writing, it's a kind of intellectual and theological writing that is not in vogue presently, that most people are not as interested in. Philosophy, medicine, texts like that, texts related to those genres, they attract more attention in translation. The great translation projects of Arabic into Latin in the 12th century is a good example of that. Or even the wonderful attention that's been given to the Latin translations of the Quran in the 12th century at the impetus of Peter the Venerable. But North Americans in particular are not very interested in late antique intellectual history, and certainly not late antique theology. And so there's a kind of cultural bias right there. Europeans are better at it than North Americans are. So there's a cultural bias there that gets in the way. But I would say that texts that are in the certain vernacular traditions, especially in Old English, Old Saxon. These old vernaculars have received a good deal of attention, maybe in part because of their rarity, in part because of the vitality of Anglo-Saxon studies as a field, the study of Old English as a field. That's where we see good attention being given to these traditions. I think the bias again, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Do you think it is possible, there are ways of confronting this bias? Because, for example, you mentioned philosophy as a subject against which there is no bias. But Dionysius, for example, Dionysius, who is part of your research and whose works were translated multiple times during the Middle Ages before the 13th century. Dionysius is the scholar who explained Christian teaching in terms of classical philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, I really just think that the reason I came to the project is that I was doing some research for an article about the reception of Herodotus in the Western Middle Ages, and you can read this in last year's Speculum, where it came out. But then in considering the idea of what Greek texts were known in the West, I had to, of course, deal with patristics and found that there was almost nothing there. And so that's my nose is always led towards the stuff that is unstudied. This might be because I'm a Canadian and I don't like confrontation, and so I naturally gravitate towards fields where there's no historiography. So I don't have to disagree with anybody. And so the way to make this stuff more the way to get people talking about this stuff is simply to show that it's there, to make it available, to drag it out of the early modern editions where it sits, or out of the PL or the PG where it sits, and to make it legible to scholars. Because once you set it down in front of students and say, look at these, our Western medieval audiences are imbibing all of this Greek learning, and we really don't yet know how it has affected the way they think and the way they consider doctrine, the way they consider devotion. And there's wonderful hints that it's it has a strong impact. Once you put it on the table and make it legible, then people become interested in it. The problem is that right now there's just never been anybody to unpack 400 years of kind of accrued, random, haphazard learning on the general field, and to sit it down in between two covers and say, here's the state of the question. Here's what's available. Here's what needs to be done. But here's where you can go if you have a question. And that's what the project is really all about.
Do you think this problem of privileging the originals applies to editions of texts as well? And I'm now thinking about my own work, because I work on medieval translations of the Bible. And so I use standard editions of the Latin Bible, but they can tell me very little about the source text that my 14th century translators were using, because they do not record the variants from my periods. And so, because most editions try to reconstruct the earliest known form of the text and neglects variants that belong to later periods.
Yeah, it's a huge problem. And it's also it unmasks the deficiency of the modern critical edition, which is that it's either a modern cultural product and that it's an amalgam of a whole bunch of different readings, or it's a static picture of one phase in the life cycle of the text. And both of those things have to be taken into account. That being said, I'm all for critical editions when presented transparently. I'm finishing one right now for Oxford Medieval Texts. They take a long time, and and in North America, at least, you get almost no credit for them. No one understands what they mean. Try and talk to a dean in a major college to say, here's my critical edition of this Latin text, and they have no way to quantify it. They don't know what it is. So the whole kind of industry of the recovery and creation of critical editions, the kind that we use to do the kind of research that we need to do, especially when we can't have access to the archives and the libraries, there's challenges to that. And then the product in the end is also limited because it can't hope to do justice, at least in print form. It can't hope to do justice to the incredibly rich manuscript traditions that some of these texts enjoy. The other irony, of course, going back to the Beowulf question, is one could argue that Beowulf has had so much, Beowulf may not have had as much attention in 300 manuscripts because no one would have created the critical edition because it takes too long. And so we naturally gravitate towards texts that have a smaller edition or a smaller run of copies. And many of the encyclopedic 13th century texts that survive in hundreds of manuscripts have never been edited, simply, even though they were hugely popular, simply because the labor involved is too much, the technical skill is too great, and the number of manuscripts is overwhelming. Those are the things we should go to, right? Those are like those are the hits. Instead, we are relegated to working with B-sides and these texts with very little cultural, perhaps very little cultural purpose or purchase. The Saint's Life and Vernacular collection that I'm translating right now, both of the texts that I'm dealing with survive in 3 to 5 manuscripts, which is perfect for me with my skill set, but arguably very minor in terms of how the impact that they had on medieval people. So I don't know how to remedy the situation in terms of how do we create a critical edition that does justice to the richness of a manuscript tradition, without necessarily creating a hierarchy of here's the main text and here's the relegating the rest of it to the notes. I don't know, but I acknowledge it's a problem.
Yeah, I can't agree more with what you said about the difficulty of producing editions of widely circulated texts.
Mm-hmm.
And this is partly to do with how research is funded nowadays. It is extremely difficult to get funding for a project that is more than 3 years long. And if your text survives in 300 manuscripts, you will need more than 3 years.
Oh my goodness, yes.
Can I now ask the panelists for any comments or any questions to Scott? All right, fine. We will leave it then for the end of the session. But if you have any questions, then sorry, would you like, Mike? Would you like to ask?
Yeah, and Karen also, I think.
Yes, please do.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think it's getting worse even, especially with the digital medium that seems to be much more geared towards diplomatic transcriptions. I think you saw that in many talks here at the conference. And yeah, the critical edition has some defensive work to do in the coming years. I think it will take a while before people will start realizing, hey, we also need critical editions. So I very much second what you were saying.
Thank you.
Oh, I actually had a question there, but it also related to the digital. I was going to ask if you think, Scott, that the digital would actually lead to, I don't know, an ease of making editions. I also know that there's a trend towards going away from it. In our project, we're doing a lot of new cataloging and kind of going through, at least on the fragments, going through the old transcriptions, seeing that they're not complete and adding to the data as it were. But also in the art historical side, because it's an interdisciplinary project, our art historian has said, well, this is wonderful, it's like we're doing a new edition. So that in our project, at least, it's not the same as its text. And I totally understand and hear you when you say, the ones that we only have certain, like 5 or 3, extant manuscripts. So that's the one that's so much more easier than when you have then there's A, B, A1, A, and then a whole 100 years of but anyway, so my question was really if you can see the digital actually aiding the creation of edition. So sort of not exactly what Mike said, but
well, yeah. That's not my skill set, and I have to be very self-conscious of the fact that I know Laura Moriali is in the audience here, and we've had many conversations about this, Laura and I. She's always trying to bring me into the 20th century, let alone the 21st century. And I should say too that this is not my specialty. I'm a historian. My experience, if you would give me 1 second about this, I think that all medievalists, given the amount of time we spend with text, one of the best things that you can do is to create a critical edition, even of a short text, and ideally a translation to make your work more accessible. But I've found that as a historian and as someone who's done Latin now for 30 years, when I approach publishers about doing critical editions and things like this, especially, well, I won't mention it. I won't mention the people I'm working with. I am seen as being an outsider because I'm not a Latinist, a medieval Latinist or a classicist. And therefore I've been assigned a handler for my translations. So someone who can check everything that I do. And you know, again, I'm not a conflict I'm not a guy who embraces conflict, and so I go along, that's fine. I'm happy to have anybody read my work and make it better or whatnot. But there's a lot of gatekeeping that goes on in the field, and in that respect, and that's a shame. I mean, it's good for quality control, but it's a shame because then if you don't feel like you're part of the club, or if you've got the kind of ego that says you can't have people condescend to you, then you may not be able to play, and that's a shame. Right? I really think it is a shame because we need more of these texts to be out there. And they're amazing texts. I mean, really, frankly, they're amazing texts. But the other thing I should say is my project, of course, has nothing to do with text editing at the moment. That's just another thing I'm doing because I think every medievalist should do it. I personally, I am using, because I have so few texts, because I can put most of them up on my screen, and because I'm dealing with a brick and mortar publisher, I have no plans to do anything related to the digital, thing of my work. The digital presentation of my work, except where the series that I'm going to be publishing in actually has an online interface, and you can look at their ebooks and stuff like that, and use that kind of search function. I'm absolutely certain there are digital tools out there that would help in this process. I'm just not the one to talk about them because I've never used them.
Great, thank you very much. Can I now move on and ask questions for Sarah Desmond? Could you comment on this process of recycling, which is the reason why some of your texts are preserved? So, for example, Rawlinson fragments that you discussed survive because manuscripts were reused, and parchment was reused on bindings, if I understood correctly. Could you comment on this process? Do you think that some texts are more likely to survive because they are reused? For example, are liturgical manuscripts or fragments of liturgical manuscripts more likely to be used in this way? Because liturgical books were mostly handsome books. They were usually written on parchment, and parchment, as we have already said, is a durable material. So could you comment on this process of recycling, which is also relevant for some other papers in our session, Sarah's paper, for example?
Yeah, thank you. The activity of recycling is the reason why we have almost any polyphony surviving from medieval England. So as I mentioned in my paper, there is only one codex, full polyphonic codex that survives that was copied in the British Isles from this time period that I'm looking at. In fact, from the Winchester Troper through to the Old Hall, which is like 11th century to the 15th century, it's all fragments apart from this one codex of polyphony that survives. But you're right, the vast majority of those reused fragments are of liturgical polyphony. So there are, of course, fragments from liturgical manuscripts that are plain chant. But in terms of other types of music, such as, songs in Middle English, where we tend to find those are copied as pieces copied in miscellaneous manuscripts. But, the vast majority of those fragments are liturgical polyphony. And so I think we don't really know, and I commented on this in my paper, whether it's sort of serendipitous that the sorry I think Elizabeth has disappeared, so I have to pick somebody else to speak to now on my screen. Sorry, I'm just focusing on one square in my gallery. Okay, I'll pick somebody else. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought, but the amount of fragments that survive from Worcester is definitely out of sync with what we find surviving from other centers, and I think that we just don't know enough whether that's just look. So some, there has been scholarship done in other fields. So some of you, and I think Mike Kestemont might be interested in this article, 14th century scholar named Michael Scott Cuthbert has done analysis of the surviving repertory from Trecento, Italy, and has sort of done statistical sort of analysis of like, what do we think has survived versus what has actually survived? Because medieval musicologists tend to rely on this metaphor of the iceberg, and that we're really only seeing the tip of the iceberg. And what he demonstrates from his analysis of what survives and the concordance patterns, and how many manuscripts that these pieces are copied in versus how many we think they might have been copied in, he actually thinks probably about 75% of what we have is from that total number. And it actually has been borne out, his studies from, so he wrote this article in 2009, and fragments that have appeared on the scene since the time he wrote that article, we're finding that most of them, like 3 out of 4 pieces, will be pieces we already know. But that is for a particular, geographic area where there's a lot of complete codices that survive. So it's not the same case in England, where we have mostly fragments that are surviving. And so I think perhaps a different type of analysis will need to be done there to try and calculate the degree of loss of liturgical English polyphony.
Do you have a reference for that paper that you could share in the chat?
Yes, sure, absolutely. Yeah. It's called Tipping the Iceberg, but I'll put the whole reference in the chat.
Cool, thank you.
I mean, if I could add a comment there to what Karen was saying, and to the question about how common was it that particular kinds of manuscripts tend to crop up in binding fragments. And I think it's maybe not a simple question of redundancy on where the turnover is and where manuscripts of particular categories may be more likely to become need to be replaced, though that obviously is a major factor. It may also have something to do with the organization of repair and rebinding, which may not be the same in different institutional contexts. Mm-hmm. So one reason it occurred to me that liturgical manuscripts may crop up so much in the remains of ecclesiastical institutional bindings could be in the role of the presenter as somebody who was also very often involved in the administration and care of books. And so the sorts of books that the presenter might have most access to, or his or her right-hand man or woman, the sacrist, might be precisely those sorts of books. Whereas in a university context, perhaps you might be more likely to be finding in the bindings copies of worn out commentaries on the sentences. But that history and the potential diversity of that history could be something that's very interesting to pursue and would need to be taken into account. That a pattern you might have in one context one might need to hesitate before generalizing too much from it. I think we lost our moderator. Yeah.
Mike, why don't you speak?
Sorry, thanks for that. I think we shouldn't forget that the kind of loss that we see is often pretty Darwinian, in the sense that it's not the most beautiful texts that will remain. It's the texts that are for some reason more useful than others at a given point. And that's, yeah. So I don't want to go all Darwin about this, but so I think there's also a big difference between things that survive in fragments which are often, they survive because of their utility, as opposed to full codices that survive, that are often kept and curated because of their beauty or truth or whatever. So there's probably a distinction between what survives as a whole and what survives by chance.
Worthwhile flagging here the work of Paolo Trovato on extrapolating from the survival of early printed editions, of which we know the print runs, and applying that to manuscripts. It's not very helpful because actually it goes from 300 to 1 really, but it is at least some way of looking at how do things get lost in transmission and handed down. There are problems about that, as Mike says, because paper is much less valuable than parchment and much less durable, but still, manuscripts could also be used for many other things if they're made of parchment, such as window panes, coming to one of the most important medieval Spanish manuscripts. So yeah, so there's lots of various problems, but Trovato's work is quite good, I think.
If I could, oh, sorry.
No, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I was just going to say for my material, so even though it shows a continuity with the medieval reuse of parchment from obsolete books and so on, it's often brought up and in a Reformation context, as in this is sort of a new thing and they're destroying all the old books and how, you know, and all the old head. But it's a very wide collection, which is one of the reasons that it's so valuable, and it's great that we can access some of it online anyway. But it's everything from Bibles to hagiographical text, to law texts, liturgy, as well as that's what I study, theology, and also medical texts. So there's everything that they didn't find useful in the 16th century, basically, that were confiscated from the churches. So there is that aspect of sort of a political reason, but at the same time, it almost seems non-discriminatory, if you want to, in the way, like it's not because they're obsolete, but everything is obsolete. So it's quite a large span, which is what I was going to say.
If I can go back to Mike's point there about the Darwinian nature of manuscript survival, I actually had a question about that related to some of the data that you presented in your own presentation, Mike. So towards the end of the presentation, you showed some differences between manuscript survival in the Low Countries and manuscript survival in England and France. And I wondered if, because you were focusing on chivalric romances, if that might have something to do with the kinds of manuscripts in which chivalric romances survive in the different areas. So, I work a bit on the French tradition. In the French tradition, a lot of chivalric romances survive in these very beautiful illuminated manuscripts, relative to England, where we don't have as many chivalric romances surviving in these more sumptuous, beautiful manuscripts. So I wondered if that might have something to do with the differences that you noticed in terms of regions.
Thank you very much. That's a great question. And I didn't think too much about that yet, but that's very well possible. So the fact that this literature has a different status in a particular region that resulted in a different kind of manuscript tradition. Yeah, so that could totally have an effect. The problem there might be to get the right metadata for all these manuscripts. Because also the status of a book is sometimes difficult to capture in metadata. Like you could have one illustration and then it becomes an illustrated book. So it's not always easy to have the good metadata to capture that. By the way, I saw your own presentation this morning, and so maybe we should talk about seeing what you were doing, because we know the composition of many libraries before the Second World War. We know what happened during the Second World War. So this would actually be a great case study to validate some of these methods, to see whether we can reconstruct the original holdings in these destroyed libraries. But thank you very much about that, for that question about the actual books. I will have to think about that. It's a very good suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah, and we'll have to talk, although I think the data set that I'm looking at is much smaller than the data set that you were looking at, because loss in the 20th century was, relatively limited compared to loss in, say, the 15th or 16th century. But yeah, we'll have to compare notes at some point.
Yeah, cool.
Should we?
I need to apologize because my computer suddenly crashed and it took a while to restart everything. So I'm sorry, and I hope that some questions were asked to speakers. So would you like me to continue now?
Yeah, I think you're back at the perfect moment.
Yeah.
There's one question that came in over the chat while you were off, and I'd just like to draw the panel's attention to it. It's from Jenny Grimm and says, given what has survived only as fragments, do you think that more institutions/funding bodies should be prioritizing their fragment collections over their intact MSS? So if the panel could address that, please.
No, nobody. I think a no. And somehow I just want them to oh, I see, digitization. Okay. No, but then because I'd like them just to digitize everything, so that would be my totally unreasonable answer to that question. I think it's the fragility of the fragments that might lead to perhaps wanting to prioritize digitization. I see that there's also a comment that yes, yes, they are more easy to digitize, and so on. But yeah, so due to that, and then of course the wonderful project with putting together the codices, the international project on fragmentology, I think that would benefit that greatly with digitizing them. But then it kind of feels unfair. But then yeah.
One of the problems with fragments is often they lack any form of provenance. So it's actually, as Columba showed with the fantastic palimpsest, that one just doesn't know where they come from, and so it becomes much more difficult to fit them into an institutional catalogue and institutional justification for their scanning. Although I appreciate what Lisa Davis is saying there, but that is a problem with it, in that there is no formal metadata to be added to just the fragment.
Yeah, although I was surprised, I think it was in Sarah's presentation where you were able to do surprisingly a lot with a very small piece of parchment, like localizing it on the couple, sometimes on a single name that is mentioned. So I thought that was very inspiring. Even although they are fragments, sometimes you can do tremendous things with them.
Yeah, so we're kind of resting on the shoulders of the enormous work that Tony Schmid and then later on Jan Brunus had at the National Archives. And the provenance of this, is due to ecological, paleographical, and all sorts of other factors that have been, and there's many other people who have also worked on the fragments who I am not naming, of course, and all their work combined has led to these sorts of things. But one of where the fragments have been used, and that is then we can determine that based on what the account books, in most cases, not all cases, but where the account books were, where they were used as covers on the accounts. So that's why. But so that one that I showed and there was a piece of what it was probably a personal review. I wish there were a name on it, but there isn't.
Can I ask another question for Sarah? And this is again from a member of the audience. So the question is, is there any way in the database for even hypothetically reconstructing calendars? And is there any possibility of generating a characteristic calendar for each diocese? So when you were demonstrating the database and telling us about that, I think there are two ways of organizing the material. You can treat calendars as sources of data, and then you can map different feasts and see where they were celebrated and so on. Or you can privilege the source itself. Ideally, you should be able to do both. But is it possible to, will the database help to study calendars and to study liturgical use that we see in calendars? Because of course, calendars about which we know can be used to locate and to date calendars that are more fragmentary and about which we know less.
Yeah, so right now, yes, I definitely hope that is going to be the case. That is the idea. We are prioritizing the feast, so we are, as the project is more geared towards the question that I present, the lived religion question, so which feasts are celebrated. But the way that I am entering the data there, it is based on what fragments, so what source, and that is all also linked together. So it's a matter of later when we develop the final interface for searching. So it's all searchable, so you should be able to do that. But I will definitely make a note of that because it is, yes, as you say, it's very important. But it is also, we're also under development. So thanks for that as well.
I noticed that you have a field place. Do you distinguish between patronage and use? And what is it that place represents? Because a calendar was made for a particular patron, and this is reflected in the use of the calendar. For example, the calendar was made for a patron from Ghent, and it will be for the use of Ghent. But then the calendar made for the use of Ghent may have been imported somewhere else, for example, to England, and used there and modified as the result. So fields reflecting or feasts reflecting the use of Salisbury may have been added to it. So do you distinguish between patronage and ownership, or patronage and provenance?
I'm not sure, like patronage, in terms of patronage, we have is the production place, because we don't often know exactly which. In some cases, with the English material, you can, it has been determined which area it came from. But in general, it's quite broad, Frankish, or where the calendars have come from. So that down to the specifics, I would say it's more general. And then with the additions, that is definitely something that you can see that now we have it in place and it's being used. And these are these new saints, like the local saints, which I've also written on. They're added, so it's very obvious to see like when this started to being used in Sweden or in Finland, and that from that time period you can then see any further changes would have been after the addition. Yeah. So yes, I am making a distinction between those two. But I've called it production because we don't often know, and we use patronage in a different way in the project. So as the saint as a patron rather than a person as a patron, so or a diocese.
What do you do with errors in calendars? Because medieval calendars are full of errors. For example, if a feast is ended where you're not expected to be, the scribe missed a line. I have also seen calendars that are for a mixed use. For example, there will be January to March for the use of Ghent, the rest is for the use of Salisbury. I have also seen calendars where color is used purely decoratively. So color changes at every line rather than more what we expect, liturgical use of color. How do you treat this when you enter your material into database?
Mm-hmm. Right now we're working on, we're going to work with TEI, so XML tagging of those different variations in the text, but we're developing that right now. So that's what I suggested there. So those sorts of things I will be tagging in my transcriptions. Yes, I find it very frustrating when I start counting and wait a second, it was supposed to be on the 19th, but now it's on the 20th, and so then I have to make a note. So it's always made a note that there's a variation. In some cases, actually, with the feasts in Sweden, they actually celebrated them on different days. So this is actually so they've been added, like the feast I mentioned with Skara, the Diocese of Skara. The Spinea Corona, the Crown of Thorns feast, is actually on a different day than it is anywhere else. So that is a choice that they've made there, that you can see, okay, well, this calendar's been used in Skara. So that I also highlight in the comment section, but also by tagging as a variation on a feast.
Thank you very much. Can I now ask a question for Anastasia and Edgar? Can I ask, the first question is just out of ignorance. How early are the first documents that you have, the earliest documents that you have in your corpus relating to Livonian history?
Okay, so thank you for this question. So the first document would be with the arrival of these German so-called missionaries, and it would be what, 12th?
Well,
late 12th century. Actually, the earliest I have examined are early 13th century. Those which we have in Riga are from the early 13th century. Because before that, there wasn't anything written in Livonia.
Mm-hmm. And are the earliest documents mostly charters?
Yes, they are all charters.
And in terms of languages, you mentioned Latin, Middle High German, and Church Slavonic. Any surviving liturgical texts or biblical texts in Church Slavonic?
Not those produced in Livonia. There is a Bible, a lectionary actually, which was produced in Novgorod, but which was written by the son of a Latvian. It's actually the first time the word Latvian as an ethnonym is used is in this manuscript. So the scribe was the son of a Latvian who moved to Novgorod. But these were not documents, liturgical documents produced in Livonia. For the first documents in Church Slavonic, they are early modern, so it's from the 17th century onwards.
There is at least one medieval document, well, in Slavonic, which is the trade agreement.
All these merchant documents, trade agreements, and contracts, they exist, but liturgical documents don't. In Slavonic, they are not produced in Livonia, not as far as I know.
Right, thank you very much. There is a question for you from Caroline Johnson. Firstly, she thanks you for a very interesting talk. And she asks, you mentioned in your talk a reluctance by the Latvian archivists to create a digital archive for medieval Livonia. Do you have any thoughts on what's on the reasons for this reluctance?
First of all, that would probably be lack of funding problem which plagues us all. Second one is purely bureaucratic.
Well, we talked in Vienna with people who suggested they could come for free and digitize the archive, and they said they addressed the Latvian archive, and the answer was no, for like bureaucratic reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess it's mostly for this administrative bureaucratic reasons. They don't want other people to come there and to digitize their stuff, and they don't have funding them to do it themselves.
Yes, and it's probably it is not fully just the National Archives' fault. There is the leading research institution, which is University of Latvia, which is a bit fussy about its virtual monopoly on research.
Yeah. Well, a few chapters they were digitized for like an exhibition, but they are not digitized in high resolution. And I mean, it's helpful to see what is there, but it doesn't really help you to study the documents themselves.
Another question that was asked on Twitter by Paul Dryberg: how challenging might it be to create a virtual reconstructed archive from known sources? he points out that there are many parallels between your work and beyond 22 Ireland's virtual records treasury. Are you familiar with this project, Beyond 2022?
I'm not familiar with this project, but I'm familiar with other projects of reconstructing digital archives, like the Monasterium, and I think it's possible. Well, the one thing is would be the challenge for this administrative problem to digitize documents which are in Latvia and to have them online. And then for some of the other archives, the documents have been digitized, like in Warsaw, there are digitized documents, in Vilnius as well. They're quite okay to provide digital copies for a small fee. I think you could use hyperlinks to the Vilnius archive. Well, some of the documents are in private archives, and there I think it would be very challenging to first to identify these private archives in Germany, and then to have digital copies, if they will even consider this option. But I know many families, of descendants of those Germans who left Latvia at the beginning of the 20th century. They were quite willing to share the archive, either to donate them in some cases to the museums, or just to give access to researchers. So it's entirely possible. I think it's just organization and again funding who is going to run this project.
What principles and technologies do you think can be used to create such an archive? What would be an ideal situation for you? What would you like to see created by archivists and scholars?
Well, I think ideally it would be something like Fragmentarium, where we could have everything there. Well, a more kind of realistic scenario is that for archives which already have documents digitized, at least you can include hyperlinks there, and then you can travel to the other websites, which is also helpful.
Or they can do the same that they did with folklore collections here in Latvia. They just digitized documents themselves and asked, as citizens research to help decipher. But that would obviously require more skills on the part of the deciphers, because these will be in archaic languages, unlike this Latvian folklore repository, Latvijas folklore kratuve, which is mostly standard Latvian, and the problem is reading the handwriting.
Yeah, so if it was possible to do it for this folklore collection, I think it's entirely possible to do it for more historical sources. I think it's again the question of governmental priorities, what they want to fund. And at the moment, they seem to want to fund things which are more Latvian.
Yeah, it may be one of the considerations, because yes, folklore, especially collected by schoolmasters and parish priests, turn of the century-ish, is in Latvian. It is about Latvians, whereas some documents which, for example, I would like to see digitized for my work, in German, written by Germans, so there is this bias as well. It's, in this case, it's not exactly organizational, more political.
Oh. Thank you very much. Are there any comments or questions from the panelists?
I was wondering that it would seem as if there are some really big challenges facing you in terms of digitization, of funding, of and others besides. But have there been any attempts up till now to produce hand lists of what is where? I mean, even I found the survey that you provided and the references you gave to published work in Latvian. That was so helpful because it gave me a kind of knowledge of a landscape that was previously almost unknown to me. Would there be any possibility of something on that more limited scale of listing even the headline repositories of where things are? So the sort of foundations for future resources.
Well, part of what we have discussed, it was published in an article form. I'll give the reference because it was a funded project and it's open access. But the project for which we published, it was about illuminated charters, so we focused on these materials which has some illuminated features. Well, the earliest attempts to kind of provide lists related to Latvian history, it's very early. They are beginning of the early part of the 20th century, and they're actually in Latvian. And of course, these early lists, they were how to say, determined by the agenda at the moment. It was about Latvian state. It was a time when Latvia, the state, was being founded. So it was a very national agenda. It was very selective what to publish and how to interpret it. And since then, some manuscripts, they have changed archives because, as I said, manuscripts were returned, but they were not always returned where they should have been returned. At the moment, I don't think there is a list of what is where. Edgar, do you know of anything?
No, hardly.
No.
The only thing, so probably we should, well, somebody should start with at least the list of places where these things can be.
Yeah, well, there was this publication which was more like an album on Tureida Castle, which was again in Latvian, but they include quite a lot of documents, and they gave a reference to the archive in which these documents were found. And it's really helpful because it just helps you to see all these different places, from Vatican archives, different Polish archives, and I mean other places where you can find these manuscripts. But these were related only to this particular location, Tureida Castle, which was very important administratively. So they don't include any early Slavic materials because these were mostly contracts between merchants, and they weren't signed in Tureida. They were done in Riga mostly. But this again, they were published in a collaborative project between Latvian scholars and scholars from Russia, from the Moscow State Archive. They were published in a bilingual edition in Latvian and Russian. So not really accessible to English researchers. But that's a very good book anyway.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I now ask a few questions for to Pablo, Veiled Manuscripts, European Female Mystics? There is a question for you on Twitter from Rosa Vidal-Doval. Given the multiplicity of platforms and repositories in Spain, which you presented as problematic, to what extent does Manuscripta Medievalia provide a good model?
Yes, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Yes, I answered in Twitter to Rosa Vidal, but yeah, Manuscripta Medievalia is the model. It should be the model for a future tool to gather all the manuscripts, Spanish or Iberian manuscripts. But there is nothing closer to that right now. We have this Catálogo Colectivo de Patrimonio Bibliográfico, of which I talk in my presentation, but this gathers, I don't know, everything who has been, I don't know, collections of every kind, private collections, early printings, wherever you can think of, wherever they can catalog. And of course, this is practical, and it's the best project right now currently in Spain, but it's not enough. The manuscripts are not there. You cannot be sure of what they are doing or what can you really find when you make a search there, and this is really a problem. I think there are two main problems in Spain, and perhaps in the Latvian archives these problems are similar. The main one is the funding. The funding in Spain is based on regions, in provincial communities. So every province has a budget, and every province has their own politics. So they can do these regional catalogs, these provincial catalogs of in each of the institutions, and this is just adding confusion to a very confused landscape. We really need like a project like Manuscripta Medievalia or something like that, because we are losing fragments right now. Fragments, different kinds of types of cataloging, different kinds of catalogs, catalog networks, etc. And we don't have a unified tool to work. So the search is going that way. The research has to use those tools, and sometimes I prefer to use the old manuscript catalogs on paper and to search there one register by one, because you can be sure that this is a complete one, a closed one. In the digital ones, you don't really know what you're looking at. You don't even know if you are looking at if they are classifying manuscripts or just early printings, etc. So this is a situation now.
But do you think there's any likelihood that something like Manuscripta Medievalia will be created in near future? And what needs to happen? Who should lead this project, for example? Who should apply for funding?
I think this is not happening in a near future, but I think that the funding has to come from Europe, from a starting grant project. The funding has to be a big project, and it really needs to take European models into account, because they exist and they are good, they work. But yeah, we need a project like that, gathering people from different parts of Europe and doing something like that. But I mean, I'm afraid that the bureaucracy will be a problem too.
Well, we have a leader for the project here, so start working on the application. But can I also ask, considering what you said about expropriations in the 19th century, is it possible to estimate how manuscripts were lost as a result of these expropriations? Because you pointed out the rarity of medieval manuscripts. Of different types, and I noticed this as well. And again, thinking about my own work, vernacular translations of the Bible, there are only 14 surviving medieval manuscripts of the translation of the Vulgate into Spanish from the Middle Ages, and only 3 of them are complete. The rest are fragments, and this is tiny compared to almost anywhere in Europe. France or Germany or England or Armenia, particularly Armenia, where thousands survive. And the usual explanation is that this is a result of the actions of the Inquisition at the 15th century. So persecutions that were aimed at heretical groups and also at Jewish communities. But how can we be sure that the Inquisition is our main enemy here and not the expropriations of the 19th century? Is there any evidence of what existed before the expropriations, considering again that you said that there are very few medieval library catalogs?
That it's very difficult to say. Perhaps we can use Mike's model to to give some numbers here, to some estimates. But for example, in the case of feminine monastic indexes or catalogs, the most accurate study studying catalogs, medieval catalogs of this kind in Castile, finds just 4 catalogs. And 4 catalogs, which are, and this is Pedro Cátedras' study on liturgy, feminine monastic libraries in Spain, and 4 catalogs. And these 4 catalogs are very rare and very special. You find them in administrative documents, in archive documents, etc. And I think in the Spanish case, you can, in the Castilian case, sorry, you can find different layers, historical layers of problems. The Inquisition and the prohibition is one of them, for sure. The prohibition of the vernacular writings, yeah. But you have different wars, you have pillage in different historical events, but especially you have the expropriation. I think this was the core of these documentary laws. In the case of the Bibles, I'm pretty sure the index Liber Prohibitorum was the main reason for that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Can I now ask a few questions to Mike, since Mike has been pointed out as the person who can answer our questions about lost literature. There were several questions for you from Paula Rivets, MST in Medieval Studies, Oxford University, about numerical data that underlies this species accumulation curve. Did you manage to answer these questions?
Yeah, I answered him directly. The situation was that he gave a very close look to the presentation, and he noticed that it is in fact based on 2 papers, one that has been published already, one that will be published soon, and the data sets underlying both papers are not the same, because we did some corrections. A couple of new fragments were even found in the meantime, and that's why there are subtle changes in between several of the graphs in the presentation. So that was a bit sloppy on our end, maybe, but it resulted from the way we worked. So there you can see how the data is also constantly evolving, which is interesting in its own right. I think that was the main question. The second question
He also asked, what would happen if you had a smaller sample size?
Yeah. So you can always apply the method. The thing is, the method that we use, this CHA1 method, is actually a very conservative method, because it's going to estimate a lower bound for the loss. So these numbers that we give might be an underestimation because they give a lower bound, which means that for smaller data sets, normally the method should also produce lower estimates. The only thing is, of course, you also have this uncertainty that we show in the graphs, a confidence interval. And of course, this confidence interval is going to get wider probably for smaller data sets because there will be more uncertainty. So we've also applied this method to French and German material, where you have much more. And there you can see that there is much more certainty about the estimate. So that is always an effect in statistics. I think the more data you have, the more certainty you typically have.
There was also a question from the audience about the slipper. would this count as a sighting according to the ecology model? And is it possible to build these secondary glimpses into the calculations? And the member of the audience who asked this question also points out that a couple of decades ago, Alan Diamond launched a project to identify lost literature in medieval Castilian, very relevant for Pablo's paper, as he points out, and where there were catastrophic losses of Spanish medieval literature. And so complex, in inverted commas, manuscript traditions contain just 3 manuscripts. But the problem with this was the industrial generation of false positive, where speculation over the existence of a work took over from a hard look at the evidence for its existence.
So I didn't see that first question. Was that in the chat here?
It was sent to me by one of the moderators. It was sent to me by moderators. I'm not sure where it was asked, but whether it was asked directly, sent directly to the organizers.
Yeah, so that resource doesn't ring a bell, so I can't say much about it.
Could you comment generally, considering the implications of the project that attempted to investigate lost literature in medieval Castilian, and as the person who asked the question points out, this speculation over the existence of a work took over from a hard look at the evidence for its existence. Could you comment generally on the validity of using models from biology in humanities? Because I think there may be very fundamental problems here, and the most fundamental problem I would describe as the freedom of will. And that's the behavior of ecosystems is much more predictable than human behavior. For example, if you see a predator in your ecosystem, you can assume that there is a prey as well, because the behavior of the predator is determined. A predator cannot suddenly decide that it wants to be a vegetarian. And models that try to predict the behavior and the development of ecosystems rely on this predictability. But this predictability is much smaller or doesn't exist at all when you try to model human behavior. So don't you think that this would affect negatively any results that models developed for biology will give when they're applied in humanities?
Yeah, wow, that's a very big question. Thank you. The first thing that I'm going to say is that I think as humanities, we have a lot in common with archaeology. Although archaeology is often seen as a harder science, they also publish in another type of journals than we do, etc. But there you see that they also have this fundamental problem that they have a lot of models and a lot of hypotheses, but that it is impossible to validate them, because we don't have a time machine, basically. So in that respect, I think the humanities aren't that different from archaeology, where they are also very keen on transferring these models from ecology and evolution to their own field. So the second question was, there are definitely differences, for instance, between biological evolution and cultural evolution. And I think it's important to acknowledge these. So I've been reading a lot recently, together with Folgert, who is the co-author on this paper, about cultural evolution, which is like a Darwinian perspective on cultural change. And there people are very conscious about this. So they readily acknowledge the differences also between biological and cultural evolution, but at the same time they note all these similarities. And for instance, the example that you give with the predator, so we also make that kind of inferences. Whenever we have a book, we also assume that it has been read, while often we don't have any practical evidence for its usage, for instance. So I do think that there are certain inferences that we can make on the basis of what we know about a certain period. But yes, in general, we have to be very careful with just transposing these models to humanities problems where we know that there are just different rules. And I do think that there are rules and regularities and patterns to be discovered, but these will be different from the kind of patterns that we find in ecology, that's for sure.
We have very little time left, just over 5 minutes. So can I invite any more questions or comments from the panelists and from the participants? Comments and comments just on any topic that we have discussed today, and questions to any of the speakers.
There is a question in the chat. It's by Sarah. Can you see it? It's
yeah, it was me.
Okay. Okay. Sorry. Okay.
So it was it was just about Europeana. You said about the EU funding, and then there was also the German the link that flew by there with the Handschriftsportal in Germany. But yeah, I was Europeana is supposed to be something that is going to combine everything. So
there are some catalogs which are on some digitizing projects which are integrated. Yeah, in Europeana, but not everyone, and that's the thing. The thing that the problem is of homogeneity always. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you.
There was something that came that's been striking me listening to the different speakers and the different kinds of contexts for owning and using and reading and hearing medieval books and documents. And it was a point made by the late Richard Sharp in his Lisle lectures on, and it's really how the again has a bearing on how the history of scholarship can create its own sort of echo chambers, and our need to sort of try to break free of those. But how much work on medieval books and libraries has thought in terms of ecclesiastical institutions, and particularly monastic institutions. And in Britain, what the important point that Richard Sharp was drawing out is how the institutional survival of material can reinforce a particular way in which we look at, we conceive the medieval book economy, if you like, and how it was the way that so many monastic books in England found their way into university libraries and college libraries, and that ensured their survival, has made those books more recognizable. And that there was this whole area of the medieval book economy which in terms of scholarship on Britain is concerned, has tended to be neglected, which is the passing of books between individuals, be they monks or clerics or nuns or lay people. And I suppose it's trying somehow to become aware of those other areas. Now, if one's looking at the history of books in Latin and of medieval libraries, the kind of texts that people who work on that tend to be interested in can be very different from the romances that that people who study medieval vernacular languages look at, and they're looking at very often their mental landscape tends to be made up more of lay people, and so I suppose the observation would be is again one about trying to get out of our own echo chambers and to see what we can learn by looking at what other kinds of material shines a light on, to make sure that we're not ignoring that from our own corner, or is it a real absence or not? That's a rather sort of incoherent way of trying to express what I think the huge value of what the papers we've heard so far today have been, and indeed this whole extraordinary project of dark archives. And I would just like to sort of express my huge thanks to the organisers of this conference for what I think is a really eye-opening experience in what's otherwise been a very strange year.
I think we have to finish at this, but I want to join Tessa in thanking the participants, the panelists, and the audience for your very stimulating and wonderful questions. And of course, the organizers as well. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.